getting to know each other. The people who are distancing themselves from each other for whatever reason, tourism is the bridge. And more often we cross the bridge, closer we get together. Nations don't have problem with each other, governments have problem with each other. So tourism is people-to-people visitation. That's what tourism is. And I want us to keep in mind, think culture, think heritage, and think the host community that at the end should benefit from this investment of time and efforts and resources in tourism. So I go to my first keynote speaker. He and I come from a similar field of study, anthropology. So now you can understand why I'm so host-oriented, why I'm so defending the culture, the heritage, and I know he's the same way. I don't mean my other speaker is not, but in anthropology, culture is the only thing we study, and we worship at the same time. So Michael, here's my cousin Michael. Remember, we're all cousins, so cousin Michael.
Talk about time management. You're talking to two Italians and an Iranian. I don't know. It's not impressive. Okay. So thank you. And thank you to the Vice President and to the Governor for your warm hospitality, inviting us to your beautiful country. And of course to Jafar, my cousin, and my colleague. And especially also to Roxana Ashtari, who took great strides in making this possible. I'm delighted and honored to speak to you today on the role of innovation in fostering sustainable tourism. You know, it's kind of ironic that you asked me to talk about innovation because as a professor, I don't even use PowerPoint in my classes. But you know, I kind of, I do that because I feel like, you know, students don't learn as well and I like to write on the board. But isn't that really what the fundamental of innovation is about? That we need to constantly innovate to survive, to take opportunities to adapt to changing times, to invent new ways to make our life easier. But sometimes we find that it's better the old way, that it's not always necessary to reinvent the wheel, that innovation doesn't always necessarily solve all our problems. In fact, it creates new ones sometimes. Years ago, in fact, I heard that the inventor of PowerPoint actually apologized for inventing the program because it made everything so tedious, even though he wanted to make it more efficient and cleaner. And so here I am with a PowerPoint presentation. So anyway, this afternoon I have the privilege to convene a session with global tourism leaders on the way that innovation can drive sustainable development. With ever-increasing advances in technology, new demographics of tourists entering the global marketplace, and an ever-increasing list of tangible and intangible sites to visit, we're truly on the cusp of incredible changes for tourism in the next decade. We'll hear in this panel about the best practices in a range of areas. So I thought today I'd direct my comments not towards talking about kind of the best practices, but try to put innovation in perspective. We tend to innovate for innovation's sake, to show that we can do it. But is this always sustainable? So innovation comes from two Latin words, in, meaning into, and novus for new. Innovation isn't simply creating something new. That would be novation or invention. But rather making something into something new, renewing or recreating something. Innovation always springs from something else, a change, a problem, another innovation. Although we tend to equate innovation with progress almost as a marker of being modern, it's really about finding solutions to problems, and often age-old problems, and therefore it necessitates that we build onto or transform something pre-existing. Innovation is as old as civilization itself. For as us anthropologists would say, culture is always changing, and therefore we're constantly forced to change with the times. Often these things happen very slowly, with a small innovation that leads to some transformation in culture and society, which then makes us have to innovate some more, which leads to cultural transformation again. This process is important for survival and has led to great strides in the world. But as we know, it also leads to unintended or unforeseen outcomes. So we need to know not only how to innovate, but when to innovate and for whom we are innovating. So despite the fact that innovation is universal and marks the human character, this notion of progress, and thus innovation for purely innovation's sake, is not universal. Rather, it stems from this colonial era as Western industrial powers encountered people that looked and acted in ways that we perceived as primitive, backwards, and left behind. Informed by Darwin's theories of evolution that were all the rage at the time, explorers and scientists thought that humans were on a single trajectory, a single line towards civilization, and that some were further advanced along that process than others. Those who were considered primitive were thought to be living as we once all did, kind of frozen in time, victims of a lack of progress, either through their own unwillingness to innovate or some evolutionary slowness. Progress, innovation, becomes synonymous with civilization, and European powers saw it as the white man's burden to pull these people up out of the mires of primitivity through education and the introduction of new technologies. This same thinking, I believe, remains today. We in industrialized countries are constantly in pursuit of new innovations, new inventions, as self-fulfilling performances of our own advancement. We chase the newest iPhone version, the newest social media platform, the newest technologies. Things are made to become obsolete quickly. While this is indicative of the current unsustainable throwaway culture of the global industrial production change that we're in right now, it's also our way of confirming our modernity to ourselves. Look at how far we've come in only a few years, we ask nostalgically as we marvel at the newest technological advances. Ironically, this preoccupation with progress and obsolescence has helped foster both tourism and the heritage industries. In heritage tourism, we travel to those objects that seem to withstand the test of time, to resist becoming obsolete. And through tourism, we give them a new life. Innovation has always been at the heart of tourism, as tourism renews cultural forms that oftentimes have outlived their usefulness, transforming them into attractions, something to be gazed upon in a different fashion for different reasons than they were originally intended. In our panel later today, Mario Candelayas will discuss Iran's move to privatize and reappropriate historical buildings that have outlived their intended designs, transforming them into boutique hotels. They provide not only lodging, but an opportunity to live inside of history, as one Italian consortium of historic properties, Abitare la Storia, advertises. Likewise, Dr. Kazem Vafadri will speak of a similar process in the spread of agritourism in the last decade. Agricultural sites that have lost their productivity through perhaps the changing wills of their owners, or changing environmental conditions, or changing economic factors, but through innovative repurposing, become historical sites where tourists can visit, stay in, and often enjoy local home-cooked meals in a traditional fashion. In both of these types of properties, value added for this site is both economic and social. It renews the site, making it economically viable, but it also renews the owner's sense of value and purpose, and indeed valorizes even the local culture that still identifies with the traditions that it embodies. Innovative, creative reuse of sites, of course, have been around since the beginning of civilization, but is particularly important in tourism. Tourism reappropriates places and cultures associated with them. It transforms the quotidian, the unremarkable, into sites of extraordinary value, so extraordinary that people sacrifice their free time and expendable income to visit, often traveling great distances and at great cost to do so. The late, great sociologist of tourism and globalization, John Urey, captures this essential component of tourism in his groundbreaking and now classic theory of the tourist gaze. Visitors approach these very sites differently than locals. They put them under a particular way of seeing that resembles that of a museum gaze. It attributes different narratives, different values to a site with just a shift of an eye, a change in perspective. As tourists, we see the site in a different view than we do locals. We see it as something new and extraordinary and of value. We can say then that the very act of tourism itself is an act of innovation. It always takes something pre-existing and makes it new. This often has great potential for improving the livelihoods of many, not only economically but socially. This necessitates innovative thinking from the very top. So in our session later on this afternoon, we're going to talk also about tourism governance and how that must be innovative. This is something that Dr. Hussein Tabrizi will discuss. And unfortunately, we had planned to have a UNESCO representative present our panel, but she couldn't make it. So I do want to make mention of the innovative role of the UN, of this other UN body, has played in transforming tourism. I believe that one of the greatest policy inventions for tourism of the last half century was UNESCO's World Heritage Program, for it successfully created a means of attracting tourists and protecting fragile heritage sites, a distinctive problem in the last century. Stemming from the destruction of the Second World War, UNESCO was forced to foster global peace, not simply through macroeconomic development programs like the Marshall Plan, or macro-political programs like world diplomacy, but veritably by appealing to a tourist gaze, to responsibilize citizens around the world to recognize, value, and protect humanity's cultural resources. It might seem silly or insignificant to note that inanimate sites could be vehicles for peace, but we should also realize that it's precisely these objects that often precipitate warfare and violence, as they embody deeply entrenched memories, mythologies, and ideologies to those who claim them. In his book, The Destruction of Memory, journalist Robert Bevan shows quite strikingly how the eradication of monuments often precede genocide and ethnic cleansing. First you burn books and libraries, then religious and civil structures, then as a matter of cultural erasure, before then you get rid of the people. Raphael Lemkin, the architect of the United Nations Genocide Convention, felt so strongly about the need to protect not only people but their places of memory that he pushed for safeguarding heritage sites as one of the key components of the convention. Unfortunately, because of the realities of the time, the great powers blocked this in the final draft, for none were inculpable after the war, and indeed during the era of colonialism. However, less than 20 years later, the context changed. Now these sites were threatened by the push for modernization as well as natural disasters. They were also simultaneously growing in interest as global tourism, aided by new transportation technologies, boomed. Motivated by threats to Egypt's Abu Simbel and the flooding of Florence and Venice in the 60s, the world was mobilized to protect these sites, donating money and expertise irrespective of their own places of origin in an extraordinary show of solidarity. This became the impetus for drafting the World Heritage Convention, to which nearly every nation today has signed on, and which today mobilizes hundreds of millions of tourists every year. An extraordinary innovation. World Heritage reflected well the changing global culture of the time. It harnessed intensified mobility and touristic sensibilities to protect and better utilize the sites for sustainable development. Today, according to the World Tourism Organization, heritage is one of the largest drivers of international tourism. So while Lemkin wasn't able to work stewardship of cultural property into the Genocide Convention after the war, UNESCO capitalized on changing cultural and historical contexts to provide a similar result, and along the way, created new opportunities for the tourism industry. Yet, like all innovation, it's brought about a host of serious unintended consequences. The listing of some sites and not others as possessing universal value has created a sense of marginalization and also competition among some countries. It fosters disparities among stakeholders, raising the cost of living and divesting locals the opportunity to live in historic centers. And it's even helped embolden perpetrators to treat them as high-impact sites of psychological warfare. From an industry perspective, innovation in tourism takes many forms. And while new technologies like social media platforms, peer-to-peer marketing, and even virtual reality, which we'll talk about during our session, are certainly at the forefront, innovation can also mean looking at new ways to pitch destinations, to connect with tourists, particularly amid changing needs, interests, or in light of crises. We know, for example, that tourism is notoriously fickle. What destination is popular one day can suddenly drop off the map the next, as tourists react to wars, news about crimes, and even food scares like mad cow and avian flu and SARS. It's also affected by the carrying capacity of the site. If there are too many tourists, the experience itself will be adversely affected. So when we speak of innovation, we're often speaking of new ways to solve these old or long-standing problems. How do we draw tourist attention to the site? How do we make them worthy of the gaze? How do we facilitate the gaze? What types of infrastructures do we use? And how, of course, do we make them profitable? Not only for those in the hospitality industry, but as Jafar said, also for the stakeholders, all of them, not the least of which are the descendant communities who claim the site for their own uses, their own ideologies. And what happens when these different uses and ideologies clash? Is there a way forward in utilizing innovation to make tourism more sustainable? Sustainability has been a buzzword in recent years. It's been defined differently by different people, but most definitions harken to the idea of ensuring that the present needs are met while not compromising the needs of future generations. In particular, the United Nations emphasizes 3 pillars of sustainability: the economic, the environmental, and the social. By economic, we're talking about not only how profitable an initiative is, but how and when it starts paying for itself, so to speak, so that people can reap those benefits. By environmental sustainability, we talk largely about how the surrounding area can sustain and support an initiative. For example, cruises and other forms of mass tourism may be profitable and largely pay for themselves, but environmental considerations are sometimes dire, from the carrying capacity of destinations to the pollution generated in our seas, to contributing to climate change through the burning of fossil fuels by the airplanes and the buses that take us to the ports. And then there's the social pillar, for which, for anthropologists, is key, the glue between all of these sites. How socially sustainable is the initiative? Are locals better off with the initiative? Being better off means more than economic profitability, even in perpetuity. It includes psychosocial aspects such as valorization, integration into a larger global system, interconnectedness and sociality, increased employment, and empowerment to control one's own resources. Oftentimes, innovation in the tourism sector might benefit one of these pillars but neglects the others. Where am I on here? Okay. Angkor Archaeological Park, for example, has created luxurious colonial-style hotels that's enabled the World Heritage Site to accommodate over 3 million visitors per year and at great profit for the government and private investors, but doing so has created social inequality between locals and those who work in tourism-related businesses, and also has led to severe environmental degradation. Cutting down the forest to build these really beautiful hotels and tapping the water, they have to tap the water table underneath. The land under Angkor's feet is dangerously unstable. So when we talk about carrying capacity of the tourists on top of the site, really the bigger environmental problems are what's happening below the surface. I see this privileging of economic sustainability not as a matter of greed or base capitalism, but rather as an outcome of 2 interrelated components. First, the objective or target of innovation, and second, the timing. First, the target of much of the innovation in the business of tourism is, of course, the business of tourism. How can we be more efficient in our work? How can we make it easier and more profitable? How do we grow our business? How do we add value to our resources? These are all issues that tourism entrepreneurs deal with on a daily basis. And from the mom and pop shop on the street corner to the big hotels. It's understandable then that their efforts will be directed towards specific objectives that are relevant to them, not broader utopian concepts such as reducing inequality or curing climate change, although both should nevertheless be part of factors in their decision making. But this is short-sighted, especially for larger corporations that have significant ecological footprints. Short-sightedness is what I mean by timing. We humans tend to look for short-term fixes to our immediate problems rather than take the long view, which often doesn't have swift positive effects, but will nevertheless aim for sustainability in the long run. Take, for example, the perennial problem of carrying capacity. I flipped those things. Something that tourism professionals know something about. In coining his term, Malthus argued that there's only so many people in the environment can hold before it becomes unstable. Too many people will lead to a catastrophe, in his terms. Malthus was writing at the very beginning, the very cusp of the Industrial Revolution, when this notion of innovation wasn't necessarily synonymous with modernization. But theorist Esther Bosserop, who wrote a century later during the height of industrialization, did certainly equate the two. For Bosserop, the more people at a site means more potential for innovation. As we near that catastrophic level that Malthus warned about, she says, we'll inevitably just invent our way out of the problem. Given enough time and new minds and new technological advances will resolve this mess before they even reach that point. And when it gets bad again, we'll just have another invention. But here's the issue. These are all short-term fixes. Is this a sustainable way to do business? To do tourism? We can't possibly know the future. Do we want to bank on the fact that given the severity of problems affecting us today, we'll simply innovate our way out? Bosserop's form of innovation is decidedly not sustainable. Rather, they're short-term, immediate fixes aimed at symptoms of the problems, rather than aimed at fixing the deeper problems themselves. Sustainability is considering, first and foremost, the future. It mustn't look for short-term solutions or temporary fixes that we assume will be corrected through inevitable innovation. It shouldn't target the symptom, but the deeper problems. This requires creating longer, enduring relationships with stakeholders in the environment, understanding their economic, ecological, and social needs. So as the convener of the Anthropology of Tourism Interest Group at the American Anthropological Association, last year I was asked to address ICOMOS's International Cultural Tourism Committee on the anthropological perspective of how tourism and heritage can be mutually sustainable. So rather than giving my opinion, I mean there are many anthropologists, including some of us in the room, I conducted interviews and circulated this open-ended survey to about 500 members of my group and 500 members of a similar group at the Society for Applied Anthropology. I followed it up this year in preparation for this talk by circulating another survey to the same group on how innovation can make a difference in the problems that they identified in sustainability. So I think these will provide a good view of how heritage tourism can be sustainable. So very quickly, on the whole, these tourism anthropologists were quite measured concerning tourism sustainability, particularly when the protection of cultural resources were concerned. They generally based their responses on the double-edged sword of tourism development. While tourism might provide economic benefits, they recognize that problems arise when sites become dependent on tourism as the only source of economic activity. They fear that economic management paradigms would privilege profit over protection. So several respondents recognize tourism's power to raise awareness and generate the will, expertise, and funding to conserve endangered cultural valued sites. Tourist interest brings with it the impetus for states to invest in heritage management, but another one warned, in reality, heritage tourism is often an economic resource for developers or a resource to provide political organizations in developing countries with a budget. So I'm not saying that this is my words nor that they're facts, but these are the perceptions of some inside academia on some of the problems that are going on. So I think it's important to know. So some thought tourism could educate the masses through experiential learning, but high numbers of visitors who are often well-intentioned but ill-informed about cultural norms or even the local flora and fauna can cause a lot of damage. So they also recognize valorization as an intangible benefit in tourism development. It can grow local feelings that their culture is valuable and worth protecting, and this can lead to revitalization movements and culture change. Culture change isn't necessarily bad. Culture is always changing, but it becomes problematic when locals are divested from their power to determine the direction of that change. So when asked to assess the technological innovations of the tourism industry, though, and this is something that we just did, respondents were kind of skeptical of their benefits. And one said, technological innovation has increased the scale of impact of tourism development in terms of the quantity and repetition of impactful activities. While certain advances have helped certain sectors become sustainable, the vast majority of technological innovations merely help accelerate the pace at which localities become visited, the degree to which they are affected by tourists, and the degree to which the tourism industry might have to cover up negative impacts. And another one said technological change can change the atmosphere of the place. But they did praise the innovation that the industry professionals show in marketing their sites creatively. The internet has been a game changer, one said. This has taken on a life of its own, though. Online blogging, posting on social media, and review sites certainly raise awareness of destinations, but they also run the risk of making tourism superficial. One wrote, how well has technology been used to market or raise awareness of the site? Maybe too well. Oversharing in today's world has led to unprecedented levels of visitation. This might look good on the outside, but has also led to more superficial checklist-style tourism that does little to help local host communities and promote true appreciation of the value of objects, buildings, traditions, and landscapes. So again, this is one of those unintended consequences of technology that tourism utilizes for very good and productive reasons. It spreads to the general public, oh, my students are doing selfies at places, and they don't even look at the site themselves. This is a very superficial kind of aspect of tourism. So mass tourism certainly puts pressures on sites and locals who live and use them, as the case of Venice and Dubrovnik demonstrate. We saw this bubble up most prominently last year during the anti-tourism movements that swept Europe. These were primarily driven by locals who felt over-tourism adversely affected their daily lives. Yet for preservationists, and this is interesting, such as my colleagues at ICOMOS, they also saw damaging to the physical site and its value, another manifestation of that Malthusian catastrophe. But contrary to the dominant view in preservation policy, heritage sites don't have intrinsic or static value to be protected from tourists, but rather they gain meaning when people visit them. And anthropologists were very clear that tourism is critical for heritage sites. Without tourists, who would the sites be aimed at? Consequently, respondents were split between praising and criticizing the use of technology in conserving these heritage sites. While one praised the fact that global internet and social media has expanded awareness of sustainability issues and even provided more convenient methods for contributing to such causes, others were much more skeptical, saying that they ultimately need to be measured in terms of concrete results. And such innovations have allowed us to conserve things digitally for future generations. And while we can't stop things from deteriorating, technological innovation gives a false sense of accomplishment, allowing the government and non-government actors to disregard actual policy for flashy things. So this is an interesting comment, and I wanted to pause just a moment to acknowledge the wonderfully innovative work that companies such as SciArc's digital preservation process and the Open Heritage Project with Google have done in mapping and digitally recording cultural heritage sites through laser screening, modeling, 3D printing, and other state-of-the-art technologies. They make these digital models freely accessible to the general public. It was born from a poignant sense of loss of World Heritage Sites such as Palmyra and Banyan Buddhas, for which no structurally accurate model existed, to ensure that if other losses should occur in the future through willful destruction or through climate change, these sites can be recreated either on miniature scale or perhaps even at the restoration level to provide future generations of descendant communities and tourists alike for those sites. So one of our speakers, Tom Salanemi, will talk a lot about, in our panel, about augmented reality, which I think is where things are leading in tourism today. But also I want to us understand that SciArc's initiatives are essentially still short-term fixes because they're not addressing the deeper problems that are creating the destruction of heritage to begin with. So local empowerment is also key to sustainability. I know I have only a minute or two left. Tourism has the potential to do very good. And respondents really said that they should be very positive when done in a grassroots manner to benefit first the local communities. And they're quite negative when they cause disenfranchisement. So there are three main recommendations I have for fostering sustainable heritage tourism that emerge from this study, which I feel are important for all of us to consider. The first and most obvious is to recognize that while we need innovation to foster sustainability, there's no one-size-fits-all fix. We need to learn from each other, such as what we're doing today, but also to make the effort to conduct solid, integrative research on each site itself. This includes the various uses of the cultural property beyond the touristic ones, to identify the range of stakeholders at each site, and to identify and understand the imaginaries and understandings that tourists bring to the site as well. Second, to deal with long-term problems, education of various stakeholders needs to occur. Preservationists, site managers, and tourism professionals must not only possess the technological know-how, but also must understand that our basic values of cultural heritage, which are harnessed through tourism, often privilege Western-centric notions of authenticity and preservation, and might differ from indigenous uses at the site. In tourism development, and I'll just go on here, there's often a concentrated effort to educate the locals for the benefits of embracing tourism. My respondents kind of turn the tables, focusing on educating tourists on local culture and meaning as well as conservation methods. And I think this is one place that augmented reality can really help. In this way, tourists might become more aware of the pressures they put on sites. And zoos have been particularly successful at this. As public support for keeping animals in captivity have waned, they have reinvented themselves as conservation educators and advocates. There are many places where an authentic site, and I use authentic in a very Western way to talk about original and integral, is too fragile to accommodate visitors. Various prehistoric cave paintings, Leonardo da Vinci's Last Supper are just some examples that our very breath, our very presence, the very heat emanating from our bodies degrade these sites. It's unfortunately untenable to continue visiting them in mass numbers. So having augmented reality can help enhance the viewing of the site and preserving them along the way. And one example of this is this recent exhibit in Belgium, Bruegel, Unseen Masterpieces, in which the bulk of the visitors' time was spent examining enormous blown-up images of his tiny paintings. Tourists were able to linger in front of these large paintings for a long time to examine the finer details without jockeying for space or damaging those paintings. Okay, and third recommendation is dialogue. Sustainable tourism demands recognition that sites are used and valued differently by locals and elicits different experiences for visitors. There needs to be ongoing spaces for debate, mechanisms for equitable conflict resolution among site managers, tourism professionals, and indigenous communities. The focus should be on empowering locals and tourism professionals. This isn't as easy to empower locals as it seems, or to have them effectively harness technology. Often indigenous communities are left out of the process, not because of a lack of political will or by site managers to share power or to consult with local leaders, but simply because locals may not have the know-how to utilize the same effective tools that we do. Education then becomes key here. We need to employ experts to bridge this knowledge gap. That means partnering with universities as well as business leaders and practitioners, and I allow the efforts of some of these projects up here, such as the iPinch project, the Intellectual Property and Cultural Heritage project out of, I think, the University of Toronto, an academic consortium of Indigenous and non-Indigenous scholars who conducted a sweeping research project on how Native communities can better understand and harness their intellectual property for cultural heritage. And I was even talking the other day with a Ugandan community leader who said that universities really are the main, most valuable partners they can have, because it's in those laboratories and in those research facilities that knowledge is created. But how do remote communities raise awareness of their needs to international experts? These are new innovative businesses and organizations, actually, that your panel will talk about later, to manage their cultural resources for tourism. There's also the Indigenous Mapping Program as well in North America, a nonprofit organization that provides geospatial training and opportunities for Indigenous leadership so that they can understand how to share and create this as well. So before we leave, I covered a lot. The final takeaways is that innovation is part of the human experience, but we have to be careful not to fetishize innovation for innovation's sake. And I kind of think about a kind of a model for sustainable innovation here that we can all ask ourselves when we're employing this. First, we have to ask who benefits from this innovation and who potentially does not. So we have to ask the who, what, when, where, why, and how of innovation. Who benefits and who doesn't? What will outcomes look like? And what are the unintended consequences of this innovation? When are we innovating? Is it a